Okay, in this lecture we'll be talking about personality, and of course the big name in personality is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, of course, proposed the theory that childhood sexuality and unconscious motivations influence personality. So what is personality? How do we define it? Well, personality is a unique core set of characteristics that influence the way that one thinks, acts, and feels. It is also relatively consistent and enduring throughout the lifespans. What does that mean? It means that personality also has a tendency to remain constant. It doesn't change over time. And I know a lot of people will say, well, yes, it looks like it does, but in actuality, what changes is one's character. So you definitely don't want to confuse character with personality. Okay, so we should point out that personality is not the equivalent of character. When people discuss character, they often are referring to qualities of morality or culture-specific ideas about what makes a person good or bad. You know, a person who is trustworthy or makes poor choices might be considered as having a weak character, while someone who stands up for what he or she believes in may have strong character. So don't confuse character with personality, as personality, of course, again, it refers to a unique core set of characteristics that influences our behavior. Now, there are a number of perspectives, and I may have skipped. Here we go. So there's a number of perspectives. Two of them are listed. There's the psychoanalytic that's listed and the humanistic. For this lecture, we'll pay close attention to the psychoanalytic perspective, being that we're talking mostly about Freud. And others include the behavioral perspective. This looks at behavioral processes. It ignores the influence on unconscious processes. There's the humanistic perspective. This means that we are innately good or also have control over our destinies. And then there's the social cognitive or socio-cognitive, however you want to call it. This has a narrow focus on social cognitive factors. It ignores the influence of the unconscious processes and the emotional factors. Then there's also the biological, and then there's trait. Trait perspective we will also talk about towards the end of this lecture. Now, the psychoanalytic perspective, again, Freud's theory of personality, it basically involves unconscious motives and conflicts. Personality is formed very early in life and is strongly influenced by processes of which we are unaware, according to Sigmund Freud. Internal conflicts, aggression, sexual urges, all of these things are rather influence the development of personality. And Sigmund Freud, even though a lot of people might think he was a kook, was pretty much onto something. Now, he introduced free association. And free association in psychoanalysis basically allowed people to freely state what it is was on their mind. And from listening to his patients, he realized that these unconscious drives and feelings existed, even unbeknownst to the people that were getting the therapy. Now, Freud's views about personality, as well as his system of psychotherapy, which is psychoanalysis, basically relates to personality and some of the later personality theories it influenced. His theories definitely has some weight with contemporary views on personality. He created a structure of the mind which he referred to as the id, ego, and superego. Now, Freud's structure of the mind with the id, of course, contains a reservoir of unconscious psychic energy. It strives to satisfy the basic sexual and aggressive drives, and it operates on the pleasure principle, demanding immediate gratification. It sounds almost like the bad side of someone, if you think of it that way. The superego is the part of the personality that presents internalized ideals. It provides for standards of judgment, the conscience, if you wish, and for future aspirations. And then, of course, he named the ego. This is the largely conscious, or rather executive part of personality. It mediates among the demands of the id, the superego, and that reality principle. The reality principle, of course, is satisfying the id's desires in ways that will realistically bring pleasure rather than pain, as it's stated here on my slide. Now, what does all this mean, and what does it look like? For most introductory psychology texts, you'll see a figure that looks like an iceberg. So, Freud proposed a structural model, which really described the functions or purposes of the mind's components according to Weston and others in 2008. And you'll see this figure usually depicted. As Freud saw it, the human mind is composed of these three structures, again, the id, the ego, and the superego. These components tend to lie at the core of the unconscious mind, and usually there's conflicts that influence our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that's thought to be our personality. Now, one way to think of this is with the conscience on one side, which is your superego, that's telling you, no, you probably shouldn't act out on these on that pleasure principle. You know, something that you're going to do that's bad is not good. There's a conscience there. Then the pleasure-seeking id is going to be saying something else. Basically, it's the pleasure-seeking or that id is going to want to get you in trouble because it's all about instant gratification. Okay. The id, however, seeks pleasure and tries to avoid pain. And the ego is that executive part. Okay, that ego, which is not present from birth, but it does begin to develop it actually does begin to develop from the id. It really starts to control the psychic energy, if you wish, generated by both the id and the superego. So there's a number of things going on here that Freud wanted to point out, and it seems to make some sense if you think of it in terms of your conscience and your pleasure-seeking side kind of battling it out for your ego to make some type of decision. So Freud proposed the psychosexual stages of development. As a matter of fact, he came up with the Oedipus complex, which is that boy's sexual desire towards his mother and feelings of jealousy. So right around here is where people started to kind of like question Freud and criticize his work, because how dare he, form some type of connection between children and sex. So this is what created some issues for Freud, and he never really was able to make psychology into the science that he really wanted it to be. But for your textbook purposes, as well as for testing purposes, you want to know what personality development under Freud's psychosexual stages meant. So there was the oral stage. So for the oral stage, usually that focus, if you think of a 0 to 18-month-old baby, you're talking about sucking, chewing, gumming, these things. Everything, pleasure is centered around the mouth. Okay. The type of conflicts that exist will come from weaning, when you're trying to wean them off from breastfeeding, or trying to wean them off from sucking their thumb. So a result of this fixation, if they're stuck in this stage, would be if you're a smoker, or you're a drinker, or you're nail biting. If you pretty much spend a lot of time biting your nails as an adult. I like to make this joke, what would Freud say? Well, Freud would say that you were fixated on the oral stage, and maybe if you're a talker, you talk more than usual as well. You'd be stuck in that oral phase. Next would be the anal phase. And the erogenous zone, of course, would be the anus. What are children doing up to 3 years old? Well, they're eliminating bodily waste. They're controlling bodily functions. They're learning to potty train. So when there's a conflict there, these fixations can manifest as being stingy, chaotic, or even destructive. The phallic stage, okay, is where your focus is on sexual feelings and awareness of self. So your phallic stage, which is the pleasure zone, is of course the genitals. Okay, children normally between 3 to 6 are just now questioning their gender, and not just I'm a boy or a girl, but they're actually looking at the sexual characteristics that make you a boy and make you a girl. So they're looking at the genitals and not just themselves but each other. So usually a fixation on this particular phase would lead to promiscuity, flirtation, vanity, overdependence, and a focus on masturbation, according to Freud. Latency is one of those areas where it's not really anything going on. It's a period between 6 years and puberty. Okay, and during this period, children develop mentally, socially, and physically. It's all about my peers and how many friends I have, and there's really no interest in sex. They're kind of just not coming about themselves until you get to puberty, which is the next phase, that is the genital phase. So it's interesting because you go from that pleasure zone in the genitals, which is the phallic stage, 3 to 6, then there's that latency period. And then you get right into that whole maturation of sexual interest again, where there's sexuality and aggression. And people who are stuck in this phase or tend to have some type of fixation in this phase, according to Freud, would have an inability to thrive in adult activities such as work and love and relationships. You might also find your pedophiles as well, or your sexual addicts that may be stuck in either the phallic or the genital phase. So when you think of it in this context, Freud may actually have made some type of sense. I know that we would rather look at Erikson's psychosocial stages of development, which seems to be a whole lot more in alignment with contemporary views on personality development and development in general. But we still have to give Freud some credit for realizing the connection between these early fixations and how it can affect us later on in adulthood, especially when it comes to personality development. So Freud, in addition to talking about personality, also seemed to realize that his patients would put a wall up on occasion, usually during therapy. So it created an issue with defense mechanisms, and I'm sure he more than likely experienced this during periods of transference during therapy. Now, a defense mechanism, of course, is the protective method of reducing anxiety by unconsciously distorting reality, as it's stated here. So one form of a defense mechanism is repression. Okay, so people, especially if it's traumatic, will repress their memories and won't really remember anything that happened to them. And usually through hypnosis or psychotherapy, we're able to bring these types of repressed thoughts out. Now, it's very important to note, if you remember from our lecture on memory, false memories can come about as a result of trying to bring up repressed memories. So I would be very careful as a therapist to not try to bring out repressed memories, because there's really no way of knowing for sure if what the individual is sharing with you actually did happen, or if it's something that was in fact repressed and maybe even distorted and changed as a result of a false memory. There's also displacement as well as projection. Now, projection's not on here, but really just about the same things. It's a defense mechanism that shifts, according to Freud, sexual or aggressive impulses toward a more acceptable or less threatening object or person, such as when redirecting anger towards a safer outlet. Somebody mentioned to me, what about like punching a bag? Well, yes, sort of, kind of, yes. That would be a form of displacement. And if I were to yell at someone, even though I'm not really mad at them, there's something else going on internally to upset me, and they're not the person that angered me. That's also a form of displacement as well as projection. So these are some of the forms of defense mechanisms that we use in order to protect ourselves and to avoid anxiety. Now, how do we assess, not access, assess the unconscious? Well, there are two measures that are used. There are projective tests. And the projective tests are the Rorschach and the TAP, which is the thematic apperception test. Now, the problem with these two tests, before I go into it, is that they're rather subjective. If you take them to 3 different therapists and you said, hey, what does this person mean when it says they look at this and they say that, you're going to get 3 different variations of interpretation because it's just so ambiguous. So, is it a good test to assess the unconscious? Probably not, because it's so subjective, but at the same time, it may tell us quite a bit, and it seems to work well with children according to what it is I've seen as far as research. So let's look first up at the thematic apperception test. The thematic apperception test really looks like this. They would show you a picture, and that picture would sort of be like a cue to telling a story. So maybe a child looking at this picture would say, it's my mother and she can't leave and she's been hit in the face, or whatever it is. And it's really supposed to tell a story that opens up doors to what's going on in that child's household. Another test is the Rorschach inkblot test. This is most widely used. It includes a set of 10 inkblots. It was designed by Herman Rorschach, and it's supposed to identify people's inner feelings. So usually when I show this in class, the one on the left, people almost never see an image of a woman. There's the hips, and it's kind of like an x-ray, and she's carrying twins, or this can be anything. Some other people see 2 women holding a barrel or something, or a butterfly in the middle. And, it really just depends. Other people look at this, they see an elephant. Some other people look at this, they see Wile E. Coyote. Again, the interpretation is where the problem lies, because you can look at this, say that you see an evil, mastermind, and I can interpret that as, somebody's abusing you. So I believe that there's definite problems, with test interpretation. Now, to help decrease the influence of the administrator, whoever is doing the administrating the test, to decrease the bias in interpretation, they have systems in place, to develop, or rather to standardize scoring and interpretation of some of these tests. So, for example, the Rorschach inkblot tests, responses are coded on dimensions such as location and themes, thought processes. All of these things is what it is you would look at if you were trained in, how it is to interpret participant responses on the inkblot test. So it's not just look at a picture, how do you feel, what does it look like? I mean, it really does have some type of, science to it, if you want to call it that, but not a true science, not a hard science that makes it evidence-based, I would say. And this brings us to trait perspective, which is the last thing on my list. When it comes to trait perspective, Hans and Sybil Essink, they use two primary personality factors as axes for describing personality variation. You are either unstable or you were stable. And they created these dimensions in between: melancholic, choleric, sanguine, phlegmatic. You were either introverted or extroverted as a result as well. We still use this trait perspective today. As a matter of fact, if you were to take the MMPI, or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Test, which is still widely and most commonly used, we look for these particular traits on what's called the Big 5 personality factor, or the Big 5 trait dimension. Those traits include emotional stability, extroversion, openness, introversion, conscientiousness as a result. Now, there are others as well. There's the MBTI, which is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. There's a number of tests that exist, but really what it says they look for is whether a test is not only a valid test, but is it also reliable? Does it really test for personality? And if we were to give it to a couple hundred people, are we going to get somewhat of the same types of dimensions when we start looking at people with similar personality traits, or is it going to be all over the place? So this is what we look for. We look for validity and reliability. Alright, so this is pretty much the end of this lecture. Just to summarize, we know that personality refers to the unique core set of characteristics that influence the way one thinks, acts, and feels. Characteristics many psychologists would agree are consistent and enduring throughout the lifespan, and personality differs from character. Now, the psychoanalytic perspective as a review suggests that personality development is heavily influenced by processes of which we are unaware, how they are expressed, and the way that people respond. We did not talk about the behavioral perspective or go into the humanistic perspective, but we did talk about the trait perspective, which is where it is we left off lastly. Alright, definitely want to thank you so much for, I guess, tuning in to my lecture. I hope you learned a lot about personality. Personality is a very fun topic. I hope you do take the opportunity to get personality tested yourself.